Hey all, welcome to Bugcrowd University. In this module, we'll talk about cross-site scripting. This is quite possibly the bug type you'll frequently find in your testing. I'll go through the tips and tricks on how to tackle this bug type and what you should look out for during your testing. First off, I'd like to introduce myself as the trainer for this module. My name is JP Villanueva and my researcher handle is Swagnito. I've been bug hunting for about 4.5 years now, so I've definitely seen the ins and outs as well as what works and what doesn't work on bug bounty programs. I also work at Bugcrowd as a trust and security engineer, and I'm lucky enough to report to the legend himself, Jason Haddix. I'm also a programmer, hacker, speaker, and gamer. Here's a high-level overview of what I'm going to go through in this module. First, we'll go through the module reading, what you should read up before going through this module, an introduction to XSS, classic examples of XSS that I've seen in the wild, best practices on how you can tackle XSS, recent advancements in XSS, tools, the actual labs you'll go through in this module, and resources and references. Here's what you'll need to really understand what's going on in this module. First, the all-time classic, the Web Application Hacker's Handbook. Every good web app pen tester I know has read this book. This is going to be your Bible for XSS. The book was released in 2012. However, XSS is pretty much the same vuln it was then as it is now, with a few variations. Another good free resource is the OWASP Testing Guide. It specifically has sections on testing the 3 major types of XSS. And lastly, check out Mozilla's Developer Network web documentation and check out the introduction to the DOM to really understand DOM-based XSS. Let's go through the introduction of what XSS is. Let's go through a little bit of background and history, so I invite you to stay a while and listen. Cross-site scripting, or XSS, is one of the most common vulnerabilities that you, as a bug hunter, can ever find on any given web application. Notice that it's not abbreviated as CSS because those are cascading style sheets. 10 years ago, you could probably find XSS vulns on 99% of websites. However, within the last few years, many JavaScript libraries such as AngularJS and React.js have made great strides in protecting web apps against XSS. However, just because these libraries are being used by developers doesn't mean that the vuln has gone away completely. You'll still find XSS on many web apps that do not use newer JavaScript libraries, and sometimes even on websites that do use them. Looking at the OWASP Top 10 for 2017, you'll notice that XSS has still not gone away. What does this mean for you as the bug hunter? Well, it means that you should be definitely looking for this vuln in your testing. So what is it? In a nutshell, XSS is an injection class vulnerability that allows an attacker to execute arbitrary JavaScript code onto a web app. When a victim visits the location where the attacker has injected their XSS payload, the browser executes the code. Strictly speaking, this is a type of vulnerability that targets a user of the website and not the actual server itself. Where do you find this type of vuln? Usually you'll find XSS on any kind of web app that allows user input on the page itself through some kind of functionality like a search function that reflects what you've entered onto the page. We call that reflection. Let's say that you search for XSS in that search field, and when the response comes back, you see that XSS is written on the page. How about changing that to your own name? Does it reflect? Now what happens when you inject JavaScript code? Does it execute? Many times you'll find these kinds of reflections by just injecting into various parameters either in the URL's query string or into the post body. Anytime you see reflection of any kind, always try to see if you can get XSS. How impactful is XSS? Well, that depends. Check the VRT. The highest level of XSS is a P2, while most XSS is going to be in the P3 range, and some being as low as P4 or P5. It's important to understand the various classes of XSS to know exactly how impactful your submission is going to be when you do find a bug. What can you do with XSS? A lot, in fact. The most common use cases for XSS is stealing a user's session cookie if the session cookie is not marked as HTTP only. Other attacks I've seen are much more clever, rewriting the entire page to make it look like a login form for the actual site or even Google. You enter your creds in the text fields, hit submit, and now it sends all that data to the attacker. XSS can even bypass certain cross-site request forgery protections, as you may simply steal that CSRF token from that page from the user. Not only is XSS a fairly versatile attack, but very fun to find. Now let's talk about the different classes of XSS and what they are. Reflective XSS usually presents itself on parameters on GET requests that are injectable and reflect data in that parameter back in the page. Common functionality in my testing that I've seen this type of XSS is on search functionalities. You just put the payload into the parameter and boom, XSS reflects on the page and executes in the browser. Stored XSS usually presents itself on parameters on post requests that are injectable and reflect the data in the parameter back into the page after it saves data on the server. A common functionality in my testing that I've seen this on is on account pages where you can change your name or address. As the name implies, the payload is stored in the server's database and calls it every time the page loads the data. Flash-based XSS is quickly being phased out as many of the modern browsers no longer support Flash. As the name implies, to find this XSS, you'll need to find it in a Flash SWIFT in order to get the XSS to trigger. If you do happen to go after these, just remember that they're a lot lower on the VRT scale due to the fact that the effectiveness rate of this bug is much lower than other variants of XSS. Finally, there's self-XSS. This class of XSS is the least dangerous variation. The attack scenario requires the attacker to somehow convince the victim to type out or copy and paste the XSS payload into the web app. In my opinion, this type of XSS is a very, very low-level attack and should mostly be avoided. However, there are some scenarios that I've seen where the original self-XSS was turned into either a reflective or stored XSS. Next, let's talk about classic examples of XSS that have been out there in the wild. The Myspace worm is perhaps the most famous example of XSS. The infamous Sammy Camcar found various XSS vulns on the once popular social media website Myspace. If you happen to trigger the XSS, it posted a message in your feed that said, "Sammy is my hero." This was an XSS worm because it spread whenever your friends saw the comment, and within that was the XSS payload. Another example of XSS is the Tweetdeck worm. This one is especially nasty because Tweetdeck actually had to take down their services to fix the bug. You can see here the payload on what was posted on Twitter. Now that we know a little bit more about XSS, let's go through the best practices. First off, always start slow. The biggest mistakes that I see with novices or even intermediates when trying to work with crafting a valid XSS payload is that they're going too fast. They'll try to get clever and use advanced techniques like an XSS polyglot that might be over their head and they don't understand how it works. Another scenario is typing out the entire payload without first testing which characters are being filtered. Instead, have a good methodology like using burp repeater. Start off by using the first character that will break the HTML and see if that reflects along with a unique string that you know will not be on the page. I like a random string like Swagnito or something like that I can use to search for it easily in burp repeater. In the HTTP response window, use the auto scroll to match when text changes feature. Then add the next character and see what happens. Then maybe a whole HTML tag and then see what happens after that. It's a lot easier to do this way than figure out what went wrong when you start with a large injection. Is this time consuming? Absolutely. However, sometimes simple is best. This is especially true if you're a beginner or intermediate. Secondly, don't get discouraged. There are some pretty difficult XSS filters and blacklists out there. Keep trying and you'll eventually get it. However, it's also important to note that you'll need to know when to give up. If you're not getting it after a certain time, maybe it's time to give up or take a break and look at something else. Another common best practice is to keep a list of common payloads. This one is important so that you can look back and see which payloads are possible given how a blacklist is reacting. Looking at what's possible will help you come up with clever payloads to get around those blacklists. A personal favorite of mine is to use Burp Intruder. If I'm up against a blacklist that is checking for certain JavaScript event handlers, I run it through Burp Intruder. This is a lot more efficient than checking manually. It's a lot faster than checking if onload works, then checking if onMouseOver works, and etc. Have all of those in one text file and run it through Intruder to see which events are not being blacklisted. Now that we've gone over the basics of XSS, let's move on to the advances in XSS in the recent years. In this section, we'll be talking about DOM XSS, XSS polyglots, and blind XSS. DOM XSS is one of the hardest variations of XSS to find because it requires a little bit more advanced JavaScript knowledge. In my testing experience, when I see something like usage in the JavaScript code of a function document.write, and within that function is a call to a variable that can be injected into via query string or postbody parameter. DOM XSS is notoriously hard to find for many beginners and intermediate level testers. Now let's talk about sources and sinks. Sources and sinks are used in data flow analysis. For the purpose of this module, let's keep it simple. Sources are where the inputs go, and sinks are where those inputs end up. In simpler terms, your XSS injections go into a source and eventually end up into a sink where those injections are then executed and the XSS pops. Sources are generally going to be DOM objects like document or location. Read up on Mozilla's MDN docs for more details on what these are. Those inputs then have to end up somewhere, right? That's where the sinks come into play. These are generally JavaScript functions that do some kind of operation that works with those DOM objects. What does that mean? If there's any JavaScript code being passed into those DOM objects and they end up in one of those functions, the code would be run by the browser and boom, we have XSS. Crazy, huh? What does it look like? Let's look at the line where the variable source gets initialized. It's calling location.hash.split. Now what happens after that's called? A new element gets made and it's a div. Within that div is an inner HTML that calls that variable source. What happens after that? Then it gets made into the body and appends it into the actual HTML. What do you think is going to happen when you load the page? Well, if you put the XSS payload in the hash when you make a request, when that page loads, it'll actually load that code into the page and XSS will pop. Let's now go through some examples of XSS polyglots. What's a polyglot? It's just a fancy word for a mixture or a combination of various things. In this case, an XSS polyglot is a combination of injections. Why would you want to use this crazy abomination? It can save you a lot of time and effort just by using this as the string in your injections to get XSS to pop. This is more for you advanced bug hunters out there that value time and efficiency. This payload will break a lot of the boilerplate stuff out there that do not have any kind of XSS protection such as blacklists and whitelists. It even breaks some that do have those protections. This first XSS polyglot was originally made by RSnake, and you can find it in the OWASP XSS cheat sheet. This second polyglot is a little bit more crazy, as you can see here. You can see that there's capitalization, lowercase, and even some comments that try to break out of anything that you might put this into. This last polyglot can break multiple contexts based on the filter that you're trying to bypass. Just look at all of the different HTML tags that are in this injection. Last on our list of advances in XSS is blind XSS. Blind XSS is one of the newer variations that have become very popular as of late. The biggest difference between blind XSS and other variations is that there's no immediate reflection after the initial injection when the HTTP response comes back. This begs the question, if the alert 1 doesn't pop, does the XSS exist? The answer? Maybe. When you do a normal script alert 1 script, it may not pop on the page that you're currently on, but it may pop up somewhere else in that application. Maybe even to a place that you can't even access. So how do you even test for this? To test for blind XSS, it requires you, the tester, to use some automation tools or clever scripting to check whether or not that XSS pops somewhere else in the application. Which brings us to our next topic. Now that you're acquainted with how to find XSS manually, let's look at how we can automate all of this. Here are some examples of tools that you can use to find blind XSS. XSSHunter, Sleepy Puppy, and No XSS. XSSHunter is a great tool to find blind XSS. You can use a lot of different payloads to get a lot of information from when that blind XSS actually executes. Here's some examples. The vulnerable page's URI, the origin of execution, the victim's IP address, the page referrer, the victim's user agent, all non-HTTP cookies, the page's full DOM, and you can even take a screenshot of the affected page. And this is all great to put in your submission for that blind XSS when you do submit it into the programs that you're working on. Here are other blind XSS frameworks that you can use that you can just get off of GitHub, and they are open source projects. One of them is BXSS and the other EasyXSS. And lastly, you can also use Jackmasa's XSS Mindmap to really get in and see all of the different possible injection types that you can use when trying to break an XSS filter. I highly recommend using this. Now that we've gone through all of the material for cross-site scripting, let's go through some labs. The first lab that we'll go through is called BWAP. As you can see here, there are tons of different cross-site scripting examples that you can go through in these labs. To get started with BWAP, go ahead and go to the website itsecgames.com and go ahead and download the bbox virtual machine from here. Once you've done that, go ahead and run the virtual machine. I'm using VMware Fusion here. Download that and then set up your virtual machine and go ahead and get started. Make sure to get the IP address of your virtual machine. Mine is 192.168.86.111. And then in your actual browser that you're going to be testing on, where burp actually is, go ahead and enter it there in your browser, bwap/login.php, and you'll be able to actually get into the web application. Now that you've got everything set up, go ahead and log into the actual application. The creds are B and bug for the login and the password. And then you can choose whichever module that you'd actually want to test. So let's go ahead and do this one, Reflected XSS. Click Hack. Enter your first name and your first and last name here. Let's see what happens. Let's just enter something random on the last name. See what happens. So we can see here, there's reflection. So once we've actually seen that, let's go ahead and go into burp here and see that request. So there's the request. I usually like marking the request that I'm going to be working with. So I usually mark it green or red, whatever your color preference is, and then I'll send it to repeater. So you can see here that there is reflection on both parameters, first name and last name. So again, let's take a look at it here in burp. So let's search for Starnito. All right, that's where it is. So let's see what happens when we are currently in um, this space. So let's see what happens if we make this a tag. Will the tag reflect? And it does. So now that we know that, let's go ahead and switch up the injection. So let's keep it with Swagnito here so that Repeater sees the actual text very quickly because we have the search set up. So let's see if script reflects. And script does reflect. All right. Let's try alert 1. Let's see if that anything happens. All right. Looks like we're going to have a very easy XSS here. And boom. That should fire. So what I do is I usually grab the URL of this. I could probably just refresh it here. Once I do that, there you go. You have XSS. Let's try it on the other parameter. Let's see if we can get the same thing. So let's take out first name here. Let's see if there's definitely reflection, but let's go ahead and search for it. Oh, nothing happened. Let's see if we put something in this. Yep. So you actually have to fill out the first parameter for the second parameter, for both parameters actually, to pop up on the page. So make sure you do that. So let's do the same thing. Let's try to add this as a tag. Reflection. All right. So pretty sure this is going to accept the payload that we had earlier. And there you go. Once we do that, copy the URL or put it in here. Boom. There you go. That's how it works. Let's go ahead and try a different example here. Let's try reflected on a post request. All right. It's like the same kind of deal. Reflection, but let's see what the actual request looks like. So it was a post. So you can see here that it is on the post body instead of it being on a get request. So let's go ahead and mark that. Let's mark it purple. Send it to repeater. Let's go through the same steps. Again, always start slow because you'll never know what kind of filter you're up against. So let's just make it very easy. There it is. And it does put the tag in. So again, it's going to be fairly simple, but again, let's go through it slow. This time let's do a different injection. Actually, let's do body. This one's one of my favorites. Body, because it is an auto loading XSS. So let's see if that. Yep, that definitely does work. Alert 1. Yep, that's definitely going to pop. So let's go ahead and actually we can copy the URL, and I have burp set up here. I have this extension. It allows me to actually use and post bodies. So I'll put the URL there. Go ahead and whoops, mess that up. Go ahead and take the post body. Hit execute. Boom. There you go. And that's an example of reflected XSS using a post body. And this add-on is actually called, for those of you who want to use it, it's called Hackbar. So I use Firefox for all of my testing. I believe Firefox to be the superior browser for web application testing. There's a lot of stuff in Chrome, but Chrome doesn't have as many extensions as Firefox. It doesn't have this very neat extension here that allows you to have tree-style tabs and lets you use the browser in such a way that it's more effective in terms of the amount of space that you have to use. So these are the tools that I tend to use. I tend to use Firefox, but you can use pretty much any browser. But Burp is definitely the standard for doing your testing. So definitely do use these tools if you do end up, kind of going through these labs.